into our keynote presentation for lunch, and we're going to talk about marijuana laws at the federal, state, and the local level and how they are being enforced. I am very pleased to be joined by three gentlemen who have worked very hard in this area, all in very different capacities. So we have Chris Lindsey, who he and I worked together years ago at the Marijuana Policy Project. When I first started working on marijuana policy in Texas, Chris was on the team doing Texas policy analysis and was really important in helping us to have the foundation, the legal foundation for moving forward with policy that makes sense in Texas and achieves our objectives of reducing penalties for low-level possession, eliminating collateral consequences, the important details that are necessary in legislation in order to make it effective. He's now working on federal policy with MPP, and today we'll be offering that perspective as we move forward. We've also got Shannon Edmonds, who works at the local level with the, well, statewide actually, with folks that are locally elected. He works with the Texas District and County Attorney Association, which is the organization of prosecutors throughout the state. So no doubt has seen things evolving over the most recent years, probably the fastest and most interestingly. And then it is my great honor to introduce Representative Joe Moody, who has been a champion of marijuana law reform for many years. He's a former prosecutor from El Paso, and we started working together in 2014. And in 15, he introduced his legislation to reduce penalties for low-level possession, something that people agree with regardless of partisanship. Very grateful for your leadership. Thank you for being here, all three of you. So things are evolving rapidly at the federal, state, and local level. So we are going to dive right into it if I can find my notes. Okay, so let's start at the federal level, because that is really where it all started, with prohibition that then was implemented at the state level and local level. But things have evolved rapidly since, I would say, probably 2014 with the Cole memo. So can you talk to us about kind of the evolution of prohibition, maybe a little bit of background, but then how things have evolved really since 2014 with the federal government taking a shift and no longer raiding marijuana shops in the US?
Right. So sort of, yeah, let me get this a little closer. So the first thing that I guess really happened that was substantive was the Cole memo. We'd had a couple memos before that, but they were pretty messy and very limited in how far they actually seemed to go. Then we got the Cole memo, and that seemed to sort of speak to at least limiting, it was prosecutorial discretion, right? It's the suggestion that, well, maybe this isn't at the top of your list. It was very, very limited. It certainly didn't change the law, but it seemed to suggest enough margin that states could continue to create their regulatory systems.
And back up just a touch. What is the Cole memo?
So the Cole memo was written during the Obama administration by a deputy U.S. attorney, James Cole. And it was an attempt to try to harmonize several letters that had or memos that had been generated out of the Department of Justice over, I think, 3 at that point, at least 2 had been sort of put out. And they tried to sort of frame it up as, okay, we're not really after medical cannabis patients or their caregivers. And so they'd make a statement like that if they're in clear and unambiguous compliance with state law. There were some very, very specific phrases in there, and you know, folks like me, I was a cannabis attorney at the time, you know, we sort of made the most of that stuff, and I think to our own discredit, frankly, we probably read a little bit too much into those statements. Well, so here comes the Cole memo with an effort to try to clarify where the federal government really is, what it's going to tolerate, and under what circumstances. And that seemed to sort of set a new stage. It was the first time we'd heard anything where the federal government was actually talking about business interests and licensing them at the state level. So it was kind of a big deal. And it was in place for a while until U.S. Attorney Jeff Sessions came along and rescinded it. So just so you know, nobody actually ever stopped using the provisions that were in the Cole memo. It was rescinded, but so many were sort of dependent upon it, including banks and others, that it really still is the de facto policy.
Mhm.
So it's that background. Now we're starting to see bills actually put in play, both by Republicans and by Democrats in both the House and the Senate in Congress, and different efforts to try to beat at this from different directions. So
Mhm.
that's kind of where we're at.
Sure. And so I want to ask you another question that'll kind of lead into Representative Moody, which is, states are changing the law. They are rejecting federal marijuana prohibition and deciding to take it into their own hands on what makes the most sense for their state, which for the most part is regulating it, which is what many of us here today would like to see. How are those changes that are happening at the state level creating momentum for change at the federal level?
Right. So to be clear, there's only one reason why we're talking about legalization in Congress, and that's because of what the states have been doing.
Mhm.
So that's the only reason, and that's going to continue. We sort of kick this thing around, when is legalization going to happen? Then for a while we'd say, well, it's inevitable. I say now that it's already happened. We've just done a pretty lousy job of it. If you go to California, legalization is there. I can go to a vape shop here in this town and buy any number of products that contain THC, which local law enforcement doesn't arrest me when I walk out of that shop. So, to Texans, there is a version of legalization that's already here. And so what the federal government does is what the federal government does, but how much is that going to change what we're doing here? So it's a fascinating time in history. I wish I could say we're about to come up with a solution at the federal level. I think it's still a ways out, but that's not going to change the momentum of what's happening in places like Texas right now.
Mhm. And Representative Moody, you've been a pioneer at the legislature with this kind of legislation, and you've seen a lot change in opinions and bills that wouldn't get hearings before, they do now. The movement is moving. How does it look from your perspective in the House?
Yeah, I'll start with, I saw things moving in my own office. This is not something 10 years ago or 12 years ago when I started that I would have thought that I would carry.
Yeah.
But advocacy matters. And so when a constituent of mine asked to meet with me, I'll be nice and good. I think he demanded to meet with me, which is good. And we sat down and I figured we'd have a very, I'd hear him out, and it would be, in my mind, I had a bunch of stereotypes about what he was going to bring to the table. Instead, he brought me a state-by-state analysis of what people were doing on civil sanction, on criminal penalties, on medical cannabis reform, and on retail. And he said, look, I've analyzed the politics of Texas. I basically take big swings at things over time, but let's start with, you work on criminal justice issues. Let's start working on justice-related issues. And I walked out of that meeting and I called my staff and I said, okay, you're gonna have to convince me not to carry this legislation now. I had gone from one side to the other. So just even in my own office, I've seen that change. But 10 years ago in the Capitol, the idea of reefer madness was very, very present. Legislators thought of cannabis like that, and hearings about bills related to reform were reserved for late in session, where you go, all right, we'll do you a favor, and we'll hear it, and that way, we can check that off the list. But there was no real movement. There was no real strategy around getting the bill up and out. And that went from there to passing the bill. We've now passed the bill multiple times off the House floor with a supermajority of votes, with Republicans and Democrats supporting it. In fact, when I first passed decrim off the House floor, one of the joint authors was Dade Phelan, now the Speaker of the Texas House. And I think in the coming days, you're going to see him continue to promote criminal justice reform as one of his major planks that he wants to achieve in his time as Speaker of the House. So that's an important thing. When you set markers down as a leader, though, go look at the past. Before him, you had a speaker talk about public education and changing the way that we did our funding, and that became a marquee item. Because why? Because the speaker put the effort behind it. Before that, mental health or transportation or water infrastructure. And so this speaker has criminal justice reform as a major plank of what he wants to accomplish during his time. So that's important. It's changed drastically. We have a medical, while limited and I think flawed, we have a medical cannabis program in Texas that has the ability to grow and will grow. And I think some of the research you're seeing done here in the hemp world is going to be replicated in the medical world for Texas. And we like to do things our own way. And so my guess is we will come up with a Texas approach to expanding a medical cannabis program. In Texas, you see what's happening in Oklahoma, and I think that's going to inform a lot of what we do, even though we don't take a lot of advice from Oklahoma. I think politically it's going to create a lot of interesting conversations. And the fact that we're here.
Yes.
This conference was, this conference back when I started, or back when I started, you could have this in the far kind of left corners of the world or the liberty-minded corners of the world. And that's it. You didn't have these conversations in broader spaces. Having this conference here speaks volumes of the movement in and of itself. I mean, this is a bit, when you told me this would happen here, I said, absolutely. Haven't been to Bryan College Station in years, but I will be here for this because this is showing the transformational nature of the conversation that y'all are driving. So I can keep going on and on, but it's a drastic change from the time when I started in the House to today.
Yeah, the landscape certainly has changed in no small part because of the work that you've done. And last session, you had a bill that would reduce penalties for concentrates. And as we have discussed a little bit here, most of us probably know concentrates are a felony. Any amount of an oil, any amount of an infused product is a felony in Texas, and flour is a misdemeanor. And so obviously the misdemeanor is still too much for the flour, but it's more reasonable to bring them on par. And that's the legislation that you introduced. So you saw a lot of support with that legislation, remarkable support, actually.
And I think that's a good example of how things have moved quickly. Because when we worked on flour and criminal sanctioning on that, in that lane, it took years to build the support and get it up and over the finish line, or get it, kind of up and out of the House. With the concentrates bill, without I don't want to say without very much work, but it moved rapidly and had support quickly because we had some prosecutors that were just kind of tired of treating this like this is the way that people are consuming cannabis now. This is the same as what you consider a kid with the joint back in the day. So why are we creating felonies out of this? And they didn't want to waste their time with them. And so that we had people from all over the political spectrum wanting to do that. In fact, that bill got further than the decrim bill has ever gotten. It got out of conference with 5 House conference members signing it, 5 Senate conferees signing it, the House adopting the Conference Committee report, and we just couldn't get it signed off in the Senate. I'm going to do my best to be polite about the dynamics in the legislature because I'd like to pass these bills at some point, but there are roadblocks in certain places, and that should be and the job that we have to do is to build bridges there. I've taken different tacks and that's not gone as well for me politically, and so I'm going to build bridges with those folks that we have differences with, because I think the big bill that I would like to promote this session, and one of the things that we're working on now, is to actually put the flour and the concentrates in one bill and make it a penalty reduction bill, an omnibus penalty reduction bill. If we're talking about reducing penalties for these offenses, let's put it all in one bill and have that conversation at one time, rather than, as well as I do, you don't get many opportunities to pass stuff. So let's put it all in one place and let's have that conversation, because we've been successful. I think that's going to be the tactic we take this time on the criminal justice front.
Well, and like you said, you got a lot of buy-in from folks. We saw Democrats and Republicans, the House and the Senate agree on this policy. We saw advocates supporting this bill and prosecutors supporting the bill. So Shannon, with the work that you do, obviously things are changing a lot at the local level with the folks that you represent. And like Representative Moody alluded to, they have better things to do in their felony courts. And that's what we heard them testify in the Senate on that bill. Can you talk about the kind of conversations about that legislation and how it came to being a place where you're coming to testify and there's prosecutors testifying in favor?
Sure, Heather, and thanks for inviting me. Let me give everybody my 60-second elevator speech about who we are.
Yes.
The district and county attorneys. So all of you, if you live in Texas, you have a county attorney, you have a district attorney, you may have both in your same county. We have 254 counties. We have 331 elected district and county attorneys, because sometimes they overlap. One may have misdemeanors, One may have felonies like here in Brazos County. Whereas if you go over to Houston, you have one DA who does all of that stuff together, but they also have a county attorney who does civil stuff. So anything having to do with local prosecution that isn't at a city, like a city traffic ticket, those folks are going to be our members, and we're the largest prosecutor association in the country. Because there is no one person or group of people who could herd all those cats and get them to agree, we don't try to take positions on issues like this. Our role as the association is to be your local prosecutor's eyes and ears, but not their mouth. They're elected officials, so we let them advocate for themselves, and they do. They may even take opposing positions on the same bill, and we've seen that happen before. And my job is to get them both there to testify and then get them both to have lunch together afterwards, right? And also to stay in touch with different advocacy groups as legislation is coming through that will impact prosecutors. And, earlier when you introduced everybody, you talked about how everyone's been working on these issues. I haven't been working on them by choice. It's just something that is a big part of prosecutors' jobs. And there has increasingly been a lot of friction that makes that more difficult. Some of it is intended, some of it has been unintended, but we just had a presentation about hemp and everything, and that has been a huge headache for the criminal side of our court system. But when we have a bill like the bill that Representative Moody had last session, we did see some prosecutors, and it wasn't our progressive urban prosecutors from the big cities who came down. It was rural prosecutors, especially from North Texas and West Texas, who said, I've got all these folks driving through on our highways who are getting pulled over by troopers, and they don't have plant material. They have concentrates, they have vapes, they have gummies, and those are all felonies. I've got all these college kids and high school kids who are getting dinged with felonies, and the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime for the reason that Representative Moody pointed out. So several of them, both Democrats and Republicans, did come down to Austin to testify in support of that bill. It did fail, perhaps due to reasons other than the substance of the policy, but that's the legislative process. And so our job at the association is just to keep an eye on that stuff, help inform prosecutors, and then let them make the decision on whether they want to come to the legislature and do that or not. When I heard Chris talk about the Cole memo, Texas prides itself on being the opposite of the federal system. Instead of having one agency where everybody gets one memo and it goes out through all 50 states, we are as decentralized as you can get. And that means that you will have disparate enforcement in different counties. And that is not a bug in the system. That is a feature of our system. It is designed to be that way, but it can make it difficult if you are trying to do business between different jurisdictions. So good luck with that.
Well, you touched on one thing that I wanted to bring up is, things have changed a lot since 2019 when hemp was legalized. There's a big wrench in the system that was thrown when it comes to testing THC, identifying legal cannabis, hemp, or illegal cannabis, marijuana. Talk to us about it.
Yeah, it's been a nightmare. And I can tell you, I've become much better friends with the folks who run the Department of Public Safety's crime laboratories since the passage of the hemp bill over the last couple of years. I was actually just talking to the director of the crime labs about the ability of our state crime labs to test liquids like vape cartridges and things like that. We still can't do that in Texas. It all has to be outsourced to private labs. And so that's the other frustrating thing for these prosecutors is the state has made it a felony. When they get a case, the state labs can't quantify the THC in it because of the way that hemp law was written. And so it's a big source of frustration. It has had the effect of decreasing arrests and prosecutions of marijuana cases. And I don't know that was intended, but one of the only law that the legislature is guaranteed to pass every session, there are two. One is the state budget, because the Constitution requires them. And the other is the law of unintended consequences. They pass that every session. And that is what we have seen in this context. It's become very challenging, and it has required local prosecutors to adopt different policies on how they're going to manage their limited resources. The reason I was talking to the crime laboratory director was because a prosecutor in East Texas said, I have a line item in my budget where I want to, okay, Smith County, conservative county, they're going to prosecute marijuana cases. It's costing them $30,000 or $40,000 a year in lab fees to process those cases that the state isn't picking up. And that's a big burden in a smaller county like that. So he was trying to explore ways to address that, because it's become a huge unfunded mandate. And that's always a problem for your local counties and cities. But like I said, DPS did say they're going to start doing liquids, but like gummies and things like that, they still, who knows when the state will be able to test something that they've said it's a crime to have, but that they can't give their local prosecutors the means to actually prove it up in court. That's one example of the catch-22 situations that local law enforcement and prosecutors are facing in the wake of the passage of that bill.
Yeah. So you called it a nightmare. It is a mess everywhere. And adding complication is the rise of availability and interest in things like Delta-8 products, these alternative THC isomers that are technically not Delta-9 because they were very specific in the law in what is illegal. And so that's caused even more of an issue. And it seems like the cat's out of the bag on this. This has happened, just like what Chris was saying. How do we rein this in and institute reasonable policies that make sense? I'm going to ask you, Shannon, first, and then Representative Moody, what this looks like for the future, and how do we bring this back together and find a path forward that makes sense?
Well, that's why our legislators get paid the big bucks,
Yeah.
right? $600 a month we pay them. I don't have a simple policy solution for that. Trying to get, it's like somebody knocked over the box of BBs and you're trying to figure out how to get all the BBs back in the box. And it's a very difficult, if I'm allowed to steal something from Coach Darrell Royal when I'm across the street from Kyle Field, that's one of his sayings. Part of the problem as I sat in here listening to the hemp talk is I was remarking, I got a C in high school chemistry and said, this isn't for me. I'm going to go to law school because I don't understand this stuff. And a lot of your lawyers, they're going to come from the same perspective. From the criminal law perspective, though, we want to follow the KISS principle, right? Keep it simple. The more complicating factors, the more difficult you make it for the court system to handle something or know whether something is legal or not, the worse it is for everybody in the system, not just the defendants, but the people trying to enforce it. And so, we always try to encourage the legislature in general to simplify things. Unfortunately, and we saw this with the hemp bill, you get a lot of legislators and lawyers think that the more words you add to something, the clearer it becomes. That is not the case. But if you're a lawyer, you go to law school for 3 years and that's what you learn. What we need to do is to simplify some things. And the other problem that we see here from a legislative perspective is that hemp bill didn't go through any of the criminal law committees, went through the agriculture committees. So when somebody from the DPS Crime Lab Services came up and testified, yeah, we need like $5 million so that we can quantify this if you want to pass this law. I mean, there's video, you can go back and watch it. All the committee members went up and like, questions. Okay, great, thank you. Whereas in the criminal law committees, which Representative Moody has been on, and you have frequently you have more subject matter experts. They know the things to look for and the things to ask questions of. but I've been working in the legislature for 20 years. I've never stepped foot in an ag committee. And so all of that hemp stuff got passed without input from anybody from the criminal law system. And that was regrettable.
I think the biggest lesson that we can take away from the landscape right now, and the point's been made, is we've got probably de facto decriminalization in the state today. However, because of your geography, your geography might dictate how your life goes in your major urban centers. You're probably not going to have collateral consequences associated with low-grade possession of either concentrates or leaf. If you're in Smith County, you're going to have a very different experience. And so, Delta 8, Delta 9. And so you see the disparate enforcement around this stuff. And I think, to Shannon's point about keeping it simple, we now know that while this caused confusion, there's not a public safety risk that was associated with that disparate enforcement that went on across the state. Sky's not falling, last I checked. So I think that gives us I would hope, politicians aren't known for their courage, but if you look at the landscape in Texas and you have places where decriminalization is the law of the land in that county, then let's just create that as kind of a bar across the state. And let's make sure that someone in one county isn't treated differently than someone in a different county. You want to go further than that? If you want to go further than that, then that obviously is always within discretion at the local level. But this is one that we need to create. We need to create a system that makes sense. And right now you have a patchwork of things going on all over the place. Hemp bill caused a little bit more of a patchwork on top of that. But I think that the fact of the matter is, this is not an issue that's politically problematic anymore for anybody. Now, people may not, there's no single issue voters out there that are going to live and die by what you do in the cannabis world. They're just not. It should be a pretty straightforward approach now. And so creating clarity all around enforcement is best. Keeping it simple is best. And the simplest solution is to look at the reality that we're living in and replicate it in our law.
Well, and I'll add to that. Go ahead,
Can I just add one thing?
please.
So this Delta 8 issue, obviously lawmakers in Congress are well aware of it, or they're getting more and more familiar with it. I'd mentioned that this all started in the 2018 Farm Bill. There is going to be a 2023 Farm Bill, and there are already efforts to try to find ways to plug the hole. So if you know if this is important to you and you know any lobbyists in DC, now's a good time to start talking with them, because there will be lots of efforts from many different directions. USAG's attorneys general are not real happy about the situation because Delta 8 and the others there's no age limit restrictions. You get a kid that downs an entire container of gummies and you will have a nightmare. So there are going to be efforts to try to plug that hole through the Farm Bill, and we'll see.
Yeah, well, and I think what makes sense is looking to the systems, infrastructure that we do have in place now under hemp, with cultivation and that being managed by TVA. And then we have consumable hemp products being managed by DSHS, but they don't have the funding, they don't have the manpower to enforce regulations, which is what many of us want. That's what legalization ends up coming down to, is regulations that make sense, keeping it out of the hands of kids, making sure that we know what driving under the influence looks like, which is a whole nother conversation, but an important one. Labeling and advertising, all of these meaningful parts of the conversation need to be had, and they can be had when we're sitting at a table talking about what regulations make sense. And it feels like we're coming to that point. And so I wanted to ask you, speaking of, Chris, with the things that make sense, one thing to talk about is the Safe Banking Act, having things that make sense for businesses that are operating legally under their state to make sure that it's safe and and works. And so speak to that, please. And then any other proposals, things that are on the table for conversation at the federal level.
Sure. Well, safe banking is way out in front in terms of my list of priorities for reasons everybody who's pretty familiar with. It's both for deposit services and it's for institutional lending. So I could go on and on. I guess I would just say that right now the sponsor of that bill, he's already announced that he's going to retire at the end of this year. So this is probably going to be his moment. This is hopefully going to create some additional momentum behind his bill. What he's done is he's attached it to other measures that we consider must pass. So in our Congress, when there's all the wrangling that happens, when a ship leaves the port, everybody throws as much cargo on it as they can. And that's what happens with things like the defense spending bill, where we know it's going to pass. So we're going to add literally, I think, 560 amendments to this bill out of the House. So by the time it goes over to the Senate, they're trying to weigh how much of that to take out. So we went through this process with safe banking. It got added to that bill. It didn't survive, but it gained a lot of attention in the process. We just went through it again with America Competes. Probably America Competes itself will not pass. And if it does, they're not going to allow hundreds and hundreds of amendments to be attached to it. So that means we just keep adding it to whatever bill comes along. There's going to be another defense spending bill. There'll be a couple of others. At the same time, we're trying to move it as a standalone bill. And that is an extremely difficult proposition right now because of the partisan fighting going on, where Democrats have really sort of pinned their hopes on a comprehensive bill and really have taken a difficult position, the Democrats out of the Senate, that look, if we even give an inch on things like safe banking, that might, eliminate our chance to move comprehensive. We think it's ridiculous, but it's the world we're in. And so we're really just trying to find, is there a way to sweeten safe banking? Is there a way to move it on a must-pass bill? All eyes are on these issues right now as we wait. So you ask, what else is going on? It's this other aspect, right? It's these comprehensive bills. So we've had a few. The MORE Act was introduced in the House. It's passed once out of the House. It's going to pass a second time, probably in the next few to 3 weeks. What it's going to do is basically just get its moment in the sun. It won't get picked up in the Senate. What will happen then is we'll see a formal introduction of what's called the CAO Act, the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. And that's the Democratic version out of the Senate of what a sweeping reform measure would be to legalize and regulate. It is every inch a Democratic version of legalization. Let's go tax people and we'll create a new agency to administer everything. So that's one proposal. We'll see it formally introduced by the end of April. Everybody's saying it'll be 4/20. I kind of doubt it because it's really hard to get bills available on exactly certain days. We've also got a comprehensive Republican version of broad reform that was introduced by my very favorite federal politician, Representative Nancy Mace. It is, in a lot of ways, hits a lot of the same boxes in terms of how sweeping it is. It deschedules, it does all the pieces that we want to see in legalization. But rather than say, hey, let's go create the federal government to administer all this, it just says, you know what, let's figure out how to get the federal government out of the way. Let states do what they've been doing all along, and let's make that system better. So I'm a big fan of that one. But of course, you've got to have both sides to pass these measures. And so what's going to happen is everybody's going to let the CAO Act kind of have its moment. It's going to be given to no less than 12 committees of jurisdiction. So you can imagine how fast that thing's actually going to move once it's in play. And then, of course, we're right into the midterm elections. That's why I think safe banking is our very best shot at movement this year. We're going to continue to push on it as fast and as hard as we can. The broad reform, we'd love to see it, but the politics are not there, I don't think, for this year. But look, you don't pass these things in 1 or 2 years anyway. It's going to take time, and that time just continues the momentum continues to build. So.
Sure. Well, we hear a lot about Democrats and Republicans fighting each other. We got the general election coming up. It's all starting all over again. But we have bipartisan problems at the federal level and at the state level. Representative Moody, can you talk to us about your legalization bill, which sadly didn't even get a hearing last session? I'm sorry to say bad news. I only like to focus on good news.
That's
usually,
okay. As you were, actually, I want to talk about that.
Great.
As you're recounting the issues in DC, I spent a little bit of time in DC last year, and I think it's every bit as bad as what you just said, and then more. I've never seen a more dysfunctional or less functional place. When I came to the Capitol in Austin, they used to say, "Well, Austin's not Washington DC. At least we got that going for us." I'll tell you what, it is becoming increasingly like Washington DC, and that is a dangerous proposition for us. If you want to work, I mean, the justice issues are fun because there's actually great space to work together with people on things. And so if we start to see a polarization and continue to push people to the edges of the political landscape, you're going to have fewer and fewer opportunities to work together. And I like what you're talking about, like if we end up replicating that system in Austin, it's going to be to all of our detriment. So we need to push back against that. Doesn't mean you can't care about, which jersey you're wearing, it's red or blue. I mean, that's fine, but you got to understand that most of the things that we talk about shouldn't be a knockdown, drag out blood sport. And so my mantra, and I'm going to put this on a red hat at some point, is make government boring again. Government just work. It's not entertainment. It's not the WWE, or it shouldn't be. It should just be. You shouldn't notice it. It should just be operating. It shouldn't be something that you think about in every day of your life. But so if you want to go to retail bills, the first time the retail bill had been introduced in the Texas House, it had been previously introduced once in the Texas Senate in the prior session, and this is a natural progression of where we need to go. And the way I've always talked about cannabis reform at the state level is there's 4 options for us, 4 lanes we can travel in, and there's only one that we shouldn't. Right? The first lane is we can do nothing and continue to do what we're doing today. I think that's the one lane that we have everybody agreeing is the worst lane to operate in. What we're doing right now isn't working in terms of enforcement, in terms of all these other problems that we've discussed. So throw that away. So then we have 3 spaces we can work in. In the criminal justice space, in penalty reductions, I've already told you that I think we should do this next session. Let's lay markers down for success and figure out what those are now, right? So penalty reductions in both leaf and concentrates. That should be our marker in the criminal justice world. In the medical world, right? We can look at 2 things, either expanding ailments that are available to be treated under the compassionate use program, changing the concentrations that are available, or we can replicate what we saw done with hemp, with the Farm Bill that allowed for research to be done at our universities first, and then legalization. I think we should replicate that program for on the medical side. That should be our big push this coming session, because that's going to allow, what I've heard when I've sat with the governor and his team is, I'm not opposed to expanding the Compassionate Use Act. I want the proof, I want the studies, I want the research. So let's do it. Let's give them the bill that says, let's allow private industry to partner with people like folks here at Texas A&M and other schools around the state to do that research. And let's provide it back up the chain, because build that momentum forward. Now expand it into this ailment and this one and this one. And let's build a robust medical cannabis program. And then the other lane. And the other lane should be, at a minimum, we need a hearing on a retail bill this session.
Yes.
And I'll tell you why that's important. You've seen charts around the wall, and you've had estimates on what it would bring in terms of revenue, What are we looking at? The agencies at the state don't have to produce and do that work or data for you. The legislative budget board and the comptroller and those folks don't have to do that work for you until you get a hearing. So if you don't get a hearing, you don't get the official, right now, not that there's not politics played with those reports, but it'll give us something to use as a marker. And everyone in this room, if your goal is to get to that point of a retail market, which probably most of y'all is, all those things move that momentum. It doesn't have to be a single track that you care about. If you care about criminal justice policy, it also means that you should be working on the medical. It means that you should be interested in to know what a retail market would look like in Texas. Do all these things simultaneously and lay down these markers. Now we're a big enough group in Texas now where we can say, this is success, this is success, this is success. And we know how slow it moves too. But when you lay those markers out, you don't create like moments of deflation. Because when I work with advocates, they get really down about not getting a bill across the finish line, or not getting a bill for a hearing, and only getting to do this once every 2 years, except for last year, we got to do it all year. But create those momentum pieces, and we need to know what those look like. So if it's always moving forward, you're going to get to the goal. Chip away at it, piece after piece after piece. There seems to be some bad energy associated with the idea of incrementalism. We don't want just little pieces. We want it all. What are you doing? I want it all. Well, look, let's say if you're enthusiastic about the Second Amendment and you want to be able to open carry without a license. That was something that was not possible in Texas, and I'm opposed to it, but you may not be. That was not possible in Texas. But you know what? Every session it was, all right, we're going to allow it on these properties, on these properties, on these properties. We're going to reduce the restrictions on the licensing. Now we're going to allow people to open carry it, but with the license. Now we're going to reduce it. Look at that over time. If that's your goal, figure out how to always be winning each session in and session out, and take those pieces you can get them, because at the end of the day, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, you're going to have exactly what you want.
Always be winning. I love it. So I want to take a few questions. I want to ask one final thing for Shannon there at the end. As far, we try as advocates to address concerns from those who may disagree or may be unsure. Can you talk to us about some of the concerns that prosecutors have for the movement for reform, and as laws start to change, and how it's going to affect them?
Well, your local county and district attorneys are elected, right? Again, that's a feature of the system. It's not a bug, not like your federal prosecutors. So theoretically, they will be answerable to their communities, and their policies will reflect that. And that's one of the reasons why you see different policies in different places. And again, I think, Chris was talking about a GOP bill in Washington to just push this all down to the states. And that's how great that would be. And I'm thinking, gosh, that's what we do here in just the county model here, right? You're going to have 50 different variations of it, but it's maybe a net step forward incrementally, like Representative Moody was talking about. So it's just the playing field here. That's what you have to keep in mind. Because the flip side is, if you also look at the federal sentencing system, they created a sentencing guideline system because they wanted everybody to be treated equally. And guess what happened to the punishments? Federal drug penalties are much stricter than many state penalties in our criminal justice system. So be careful what you wish for when you want uniformity. That said, because prosecutors are elected, they're going to, take the temperature of their communities, and their policies are going to reflect that. So as the political grounds shift, you're going to see that more. I look at a county like Harris County, where for a long time was, the death penalty capital of the world, and they prosecuted everything. Now you've got a DA who basically diverts almost all of the misdemeanor cases if the defendant's willing to go through a diversion program. and avoid some of those consequences that Representative Moody referenced earlier. And they're able to do that because they have the resources. Many other communities don't have the resources to run programs like that. So maybe talking to local prosecutors to say, look, we're not just saying everybody should get a free pass, even if you think they should, okay? But that may be a bridge too far. So let's take a step of what do you need to get a drug court running in your community? You know, if you're concerned about, you just don't want to see repeat people in the system again, what do you need to make that happen? And that's going to vary from county to county, especially west of I-35, right? If I-35 runs pretty much north and south through here, we have very, very minimal treatment and diversion options in that part of the state. And so that's something that we hear a lot from prosecutors. And then the other thing that's different, and when I get asked every session from our members, what's going to happen to this bill? What's going to happen to that bill? It all depends on who's coming back to the legislature. And this session, sorry, but it's going to be as read or redder, I think. But on this issue, that could be a benefit, depending if those redder folks are more on the libertarian end of that scale, right? Because remember, politics is not a straight line left and right. It's a circle.
Yes.
Because the ends come and meet each other on some of those civil liberty issues. So it depends on who's coming back. But the other big factor that your prosecutors are facing are historic case backlogs, right? We've never seen the stacking up of cases because of COVID. If you go east of here along the coast, those communities are used to having hurricanes that will shut down the courthouses for a couple months, and they eventually dig out of that. It's like we had a 2-year-long hurricane that hit the state and every community. And so it's going to take them 3, 4, 5 years to work through the cases that they have on their plate right now. And that may create some opportunities for talking about, well, what can we take off that plate? Or is there a way that we can deal with incoming cases differently in the future? And that's a new thing that we haven't had in the past. And so that's something to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're gonna take a few questions. Dave Bass and then Judge Delaney.
Testing.
It's
Right.
on.
I have the mic, so I get to ask the first question. Representative Moody, my first 4 legislative sessions, Heather and I and all the activists spent like 90% of our efforts on the House side. And occasionally we'd wander over to the Senate side, and that's a whole different world over there. But last session, because bills were actually passing out of the House, we spent a lot of time on the Senate side. So my question is, do you have a word of wisdom to us when we go over to the Senate side and we're advocating? What's something we need to keep in mind over there?
Good question.
I want to get this.
Let me start with this. I have the utmost respect for Lieutenant Governor and the job that he holds and for the position that he holds. He reminded me very clearly that in the House, where I serve as the vice chair of the Calendars Committee, which is very powerful, that's how you get a bill to the floor to hear it. He reminded me that the Senate does not have a Calendars Committee. It is a Calendars Committee of 1, and that is Lieutenant Governor. So my advice to you is we need to have open lines of communication with Lieutenant Governor's office to talk about these issues. Criminal justice policy is becoming a larger piece of the conversation on the Republican side of the aisle. If that is, if you are in camps that work with Lieutenant Governor, support him, work on the political side of what he does, and have the ability to have those conversations, or he's based out of Houston, and I know certainly cares about Harris County. If you're from there, those are the types of conversations that we need to have, and start figuring out what's available, what's possible. The governor's office reached out to us, and I think they're ready to make sweeping changes in the world of cannabis? No, but they're willing to sit down and talk about what the policy should look like if it's going to pass. And so those are the types of conversations they have. We should never shut things down. Having the option to have a seat at the table to discuss things with someone should always be your goal. Don't ever take that option away from yourself. And we got to be careful, because sometimes, and myself included, we get frustrated. And it is frustrating. And it's like you're running your head into a wall from time to time. But look, everybody in that building plays a role, and you've got to have respect for their position and for what, for what they bring to the table. So the piece of advice is keep open lines of communication. If you have the ability or have friends that have the ability to have those conversations with Lieutenant Governor, his staff, his criminal justice policy folks, I think that's important. You have some champions of criminal justice reform in the Senate too. You got Brian Hughes has been, as a Republican leader, has been one. You're gonna have a change in the Senate too. You have Joan Huffman, who has been the chair of that committee that handles all the justice issues, is now moving to be the chair of appropriations. So you're gonna have a new policy person sitting at the head of that committee. In fact, in the House, you're probably gonna have, in the substantive committees, criminal jurisprudence, corrections, and homeland security and public safety that touch these issues. I think you'll probably see, you will definitely see new chairs in 2 of those committees, just because of retirements, and I think other people are going to move up. But we're going to have a new opportunity to educate, and so we need to look at those and make sure that we're always engaged in the conversation, because I think the more people learn, the easier it is for them to take the position that we already agree with.
That's right.
Thank you.
That's right.
Question for Shannon. Many of us in the room don't really know what this thing is that you refer to as diversion. I wonder if you'd take a few minutes to explain the concept of pretrial diversion so that they might consider going to their local prosecutor and ask him or her if she is employing it, and if not, why not?
Sure. Prosecutors have the constitutional authority in Texas to basically handle each individual case in any manner of their choosing. And that can mean a case in lieu of being formally charged. So a person gets arrested. That case can be diverted from the normal path of being charged, going to court, having the court resolve it, guilty or not guilty. If guilty, jail or probation or some form of supervision. There are off ramps that are almost unlimited. And at each stage of that standard process, there are alternatives that can be created. In some places, like I believe in Harris County, they will do things like a person who gets picked up before they're even booked into jail to create a record and start that process. Some of them are given an opportunity to go through a process where they take a class, they may do some community service, and then if they keep their nose clean for a couple months, it won't appear on the record. Other communities have a diversion program after the case is formally charged, but they may have a drug court, depending on after the person has been analyzed for substance abuse issues, drug and alcohol issues. If they have problems with that in their life, they may be sent to treatment. And if they complete it and avoid reoccurrence over a period of time, then that case can be dismissed. They may even be able to get it expunged, which means the records are destroyed. There are many different opportunities. The legislature hasn't mandated anything like that because that would limit what they can do. And that's a good thing that they haven't mandated that kind of stuff, but it depends on the resources available. And so in urban areas, you're going to find very robust diversions. I came from prosecuting in Travis County, where the county would spend millions upon millions of dollars to diversion. A lot of counties, especially your smaller counties, they don't have a dime to spend on that kind of thing unless the state provides it. So it's going to, again, vary depending on where you are, but there are opportunities to do that, and it is up to the discretion of the prosecutor.
Let's take one more. Thanks, Lisa.
Hi, this is for Representative Moody. First of all, thank you for your leadership and your efforts session after session on these issues. Governor Abbott, when asked about marijuana, he usually says, we are a law and order state and there's not going to be any legalization on my watch. But this campaign, he said he touted signing the Compassionate Use Act. He said he was open to who else it could help, and that he didn't want to see a bunch of people in jail on simple possession. What do you make of that for the upcoming session?
I, in my dealings with that office on this issue and specifically with the decrim bill that I had, everything that they floated across the table were, they were willing to have an open dialogue about it and, kept to their word on all those conversations. And so if that's what he's saying as he goes around the state, I would, I take him at his word. And if those are things that, like I said, I think he knows what most of us know in the political world. If you work on this issue, this is not something that is, there's no detriment to you here. Now, you may not win an election for changing this policy, but you're certainly not going to lose one. That used to be everybody's fear. God forbid people be challenged in elections. But it's I think that's a very good sign. And I think that that's something that you obviously noticed it. And I think everybody that works on this policy in Texas noticed a shift in public conversation. And I'm telling you, in the conversations I've had with that team, do I think a retail market's going to happen in the state of Texas anytime soon? No, but I do think that the next best thing we can do as we move towards that is a penalty reduction across the board for leaf and for concentrates, which is what he said that he thinks is important. And I think medical expansion to a robust program, a better program in Texas is right here in front of us. So let's move as quickly as we can in those lanes and then continue to promote the other.
Absolutely. Okay, so Chris Lindsey is going to be on a panel tomorrow morning talking more about legalization and effective arguments, winning folks over. But I'd like to thank the panel, Representative Moody, Shannon, Edmonds, and Chris for joining us today. Thank you so much.